Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Osterville Village Library. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming director here at the OVL. Thank you so much for joining us today. This afternoon, we have an exciting program in store for you. World-Renown Horologist Bob Frishman will be discussing horology in art. Bob Frishman founded the Bell Time Clocks in 1992, has repaired 8,000 mechanical clocks, and has sold 1,800 vintage timepieces, although I think it's probably more than that. He writes and lectures about the history, culture, and technology of horology, the science of timekeeping. He has published 150 related articles and reviews, and he has lectured to more than 100 public audiences. His comprehensive award-winning biography of 18th century Philadelphia clockmaker Edward Duffield was published in 2024. Sorry, my printout cut out. And in April 2025, Bob was honored to receive the APS John Frederick Lewis Award for the best book published by the Society in a given year. In November 2025, he received the Charles F. Montgomery Award from the Decorative Art Society for the most outstanding such work published in 2024. He is a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers in London, a Silver Star Fellow of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, and co-chair of its annual New England Regional Meeting, an active member of the Antiquarian Horological Society in London, a life member of the Willard House and Clock Museum, proprietor number 28 of the Boston Athenaeum, shareholder number 8 of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and a member of the American Antiquarian Society and the Ross Society of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And we are just lucky enough to have him here at the Osterville Village Library. I am so excited about today's event, and I was just as excited about our event that we had with him back in March, which is also on our YouTube channel. And this one should be up in about a week or so. So without further ado, Bob Frishman.
All right, every time I hear those introductions and I say, wow, I want to be that guy, you know, look at all the cool stuff he's done, and wait, that is me. How did that happen? So great, I'm glad to be here, and you'll hear why Osterville is sort of a special place for me to be as well. But Amy was asking how I got into this, and it really was as I was getting into this whole world of antique clocks, I started to notice fine art images that had clocks and watches in them, and there aren't many. You can go to a museum and not see one. You can go to an auction and not see one. Let's see, I think someone's coming in. Yeah. So, but I really had a passion to start seeking them out, and in a way you'll see why, because it's a wonderful combination of what I love, which is timepieces and also art. And mostly we're not seeing antique clocks in these images. We're seeing clocks that were new at the time and important at the time to the people that had them. And I like to start with this image because early on in my time, I went to an auction, and this is reverse painting on glass. And I knew the specialist at the auction house was Skinner in Boston. And I said, oh, I want to buy that. You know, is anyone else interested? Should I bid a lot? She says, oh, nobody cares about that. Just, you know, put in a decent bid and I'm sure you'll get it. And of course I didn't. So someone else wanted it more than I did. So that was a lesson, and maybe some of you have learned the same lesson at auctions, that the ones you remember most perhaps are the ones that you didn't get and wish you had. But we can move right along now because, you know, as we snuck into daylight savings time recently, you know, one of the kind of flyer poster things, I have a few more later, of illustration art, which of course is still art. This is appropriate because this is right when daylight savings time took effect for the first time right after World War I. They were trying to implement it during the war to try to help save energy at that time, but we kind of didn't get started with daylight savings time until the year basically that it ended, that the war ended. But this is a great graphic too of why they wanted to do it. So some people have thought, especially people who deal in art and talk about art, and I say, oh, I like the clocks and art thing. they think, oh, you mean those lousy paintings that have an actual working clock in the painting? I said, no, I'm really thinking about fine art that shows clocks and watches. So we'll let them enter now. All right, I've just started, so I don't have to start again, but you missed the best part, of course, but which was
You're fine.
that was the introduction, right? That was the best part. Yeah. So what we're seeing here is one of those mostly tourist trade paintings that were made that actually had working clocks in the steeple. And this is what's inside. There's actually a clock mechanism and a gong that struck the hour, and in this case, even a music box that would play and try to simulate the sound of the church bells that you would see in the painting. So they're kind of cool things, but that wasn't what I was particularly interested in. And everybody gets nervous right away, think, oh, does he know about the Dali painting, the melting clocks, so people start, twitching and their hands starting to go up. So I always get this over with at the beginning, just so you know that. So again, I'm sure everyone is familiar with this image by Dali. What is the story behind this, and is what you may not know is that this is a self-portrait. This is how Dali painted himself. But there's also other things going on here. You see, well, there's another postcard that Dali produced where, again, he's having his long signature mustache point as the hands of the clock pointing at the hands. But what he did when he first painted that, he painted the background, which essentially was the coast where he was living in Spain. So he painted that in the afternoon in his studio, and he wasn't sure what he was going to do next. And then he started to develop a really bad migraine headache. And, his head was pounding, but it was time to go eat. And his wife served him some really runny cheese. And apparently that affected him in a way where he started thinking about time drooping and clocks drooping and everything. So that was the story of that painting and its progression. And what I didn't realize was how small it was. When I would just see images of this painting, you picture, wow, this must be a great big painting. And it's like the size of a cereal box. So it was kind of surprising. But this is one of the most viewed paintings at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. I just saw it again last week when I was there. And obviously it attracts a lot of attention, but it is quite small. You really need to get right up to it to see it. So the name of my business is Bell Time Clocks. And that's in the early 90s when I was starting up sort of as a professional clock restorer at that time. I figured that was a good name for it. And it's based on a illustration by Winslow Homer. And this is Winslow Homer in a suit that I hope to wear someday if I can find one. He looks pretty dapper there. But this is an illustration of workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, right next to Andover, where I live. And I was living in Lawrence at the time. And it accompanied a Harper's Weekly article about Lawrence, Massachusetts, and the industrial system that was there, and how already these mill workers were living and dying by the clock, by the bell. These bells would ring, and if it was the first bell, you were on your way. The second bell, you better get through the gates. Third bell, gates closed. You didn't work that day, and you didn't get paid. So you could see one of the bells in the Atlantic Mill building. That was in Lawrence, and it wasn't a coincidence. So Winslow Homer's brother was a chemist working on dyes and everything in the Lawrence mills. So Winslow Homer knew Lawrence, went there quite frequently, and this is his depiction of those mill workers. So I looked long and hard for Winslow Homer paintings that had clocks in them. Only really found one where it was bold enough, and it's this image, which is it took me a long time to find this, and I actually went and visited it. It's at the a small art gallery on the campus of Texas A&M University down in Texas. So I know, there's this little art gallery, and there's this the football stadium that looks like it just landed, from some other galaxy, this huge stadium. But in there, it's kind of a long story about how this painting ended up there. It's a little watercolor, but it is there now, and you can see some years before that, it was at Sotheby's. Before it ended up there. So you see it's a young woman who's winding a tall case clock, and she's got a cello there. There's all kinds of theories about what's going on in this painting. But at least I do have an example of a Homer with a lovely long case clock in it. But just to I just was in England as Amy was as well. And of course you see that and everybody says, oh great, there's Big Ben. That's not Big Ben. Big Ben is the bell that's up inside there. This is the Tower of Westminster, and this is the Great Clock. Big Ben is just the name of the bell that's inside, but everybody has been calling it Big Ben for a long time. So that's just a bit of trivia. But I was in England to give 4 lectures that I'll tell you a little bit about. The ultimate one was at the British Museum, whose entrance you see here. It's the annual Dingwall Below Horological Lecture. Horology is a science of timekeeping. This is one of the most important, famous annual lectures on the subject of timekeeping, and I was honored this year to be the speaker. So you can see more than 200 people had assembled from all over to hear my lecture. And it was in the Great Hall, and my images were actually projected onto that big wall that was there. There I am, I guess, about to start up or during it, but it was quite a imposing venue, and I think I did a pretty good job. I was talking about the Americans who were at the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace in 1851, the Great Exhibition, was really the first World's Fair. And the British put together a huge, essentially a giant greenhouse, 900,000 panes of glass. They were able to build the building very quickly. It was tall enough to include the trees that were in Hyde Park. It just covered the trees for the time that the fair took over. And there were about 600 American exhibitors, but they were sort of disparaged even by Queen Victoria and by the British press. They say we didn't bring stuff that was very important, but the Americans got touchy about it and eventually published a book and a big lithograph print about the things that they brought to the fair that were important, like the Colt revolver and McCormick's Reaper, that were perhaps not beautiful. A lot of the goods here were luxury goods, but they were very practical, as the Yankees, the inventive Yankees were at that time, made things that were cheap and good, including clocks. So this is the American part of the American exhibit, and you can just see some of the American clocks that are there. One of the highlights of the American exhibit was Hiram Power's sculpture of the Greek slave. She was depicting a Greek white woman who had been captured by the Turks when they captured Greece and was being sold in a Turkish slave market. And of course, the British press and plenty of other people kind of had a field day with this, because this was, of course, the height of African-American enslavement in America. And they were, of course, saying we were being pretty hypocritical about showing, a white slave in Turkey, when we had millions of them, African-Americans who were there in America. And they even Punch magazine suggested they should have a black woman statue as well, standing near it. But principally my interest, and this is one of the, I think there were only 2 illustrations of the fair where you can actually see a lot of these Connecticut clocks that were there, that were known for their quality, cheapness. They came into Britain at first. They tried to stop them from coming in because they were so cheap, but they eventually let them in, and basically after a while ruined the British clock market, because our clocks were selling for 1/10 of what the British ones were. But if you are interested in clocks more than just to talk about them for a minute, there's a study room down in the cellar of the British Museum where you can make an appointment and go, and they will pull things out of storage for you to look at. And you can, talk with the curators and study things that, and handle things that obviously you can't upstairs in the clock gallery. And I went because, on one occasion, because I was looking for horology and art things, and they have big boxes of prints mainly of, that have the horological content of some point, either clockmakers or clocks in the image somewhere. A lot of Hogarth and Crookshank prints have clocks in them. And this is just a print of a design for a French clock dial. So it's, showing what they might look at. And you see up here, like can. We all know that as the leg kicking dance, at the Folie Bergère. But Les Cancan, actually, the translation originally was the gossips. So it's showing these 3 women who are gossipers up top there. But I just had a great several hours there going through these boxes of prints and seeing all kinds of fun things. I also went to Bath, which Amy was just, because there's an American museum and gardens in Bath. Because about 50 years ago, these 2 American guys were kind of sick of people saying that the American people in England saying, the Americans really didn't produce anything interesting. Their antiques weren't any good. Their and so they basically went on a buying spree of antiques in America and bought this beautiful big house in England. And I was there to talk about my book. And again, Amy was kind enough to talk about it. This is the cover. I have a couple of copies here. I think Amy wants one. They're $60 if someone wants the other one. It's a award-winning first biography of a very important clockmaker in Philadelphia who was a lifelong friend of Ben Franklin. So there's those kinds of nice connections. But there is the House of the American Museum in Bath, a beautiful, again, old, large manor house that's filled with American antiques, including some nice clocks. So that's why I was there. Principally, was to talk about the clocks. This is a view if I turned around. So you see, it's part of this, almost unbelievably beautiful English landscape that you see in this part of England quite routinely. And they have a gallery of American folk art. And of course, that was all great, but here is a little one that you now see in closer up. So this is a kind of almost a genre that I've seen many times, where either kids are holding a watch up to their ear, or an adult is holding a watch up to the ear of a kid. Because I think watches were still sort of unusual in the early 1820s and 30s. So it's like this little animal almost, this little life. And you would hold it up to a kid's ear and they would be excited and listen to it ticking and kind of wondering what was inside that little container. But since we are here on Cape Cod, I'm going to focus on that for a few minutes. Jean and I go to Provincetown every September for a time to relax and get away from things. And when Provincetown is a little more relaxed than it is during the summer. So there's some Cape Cod art. This is of course the town hall that has beautiful Provincetown artwork in it, but they have a nice clock up on the tower. This is you may recognize this as Edward Hopper's studio in Truro. So that's where he was doing a lot of his work when he and Joe Hopper came up for the summers. And this is one of my horology and art images by Edward Hopper. This is called 7 a.m. It's at the Whitney Museum in New York City. And you can see, the clock is just about dead center in this image. There's no question that the clock is there, and the clock is telling part of the story. It's saying that it's 7 a.m. and that was the title of it. This is a typical Hopper thing where even though it's kind of well lit, the woods look kind of scary back there. We don't really even know what this store is selling. But here's it. And his wife, Jo Hopper, kept very detailed records about all of his paintings. And she said in the first kind of sketch and workup of this image, there was a woman looking out of the window up top there. But she didn't make the cut, I guess. And I think in a lot of Hopper's things, there's maybe no people or just a couple of people that really emphasize the loneliness of these scenes, as this would be. And we think it's probably Truro in that area on the Cape. So there's Edward Hopper, and this picture is actually relevant too, because you see he's got a little alarm clock on the, and maybe even another, he's got two clocks on his mantle as he's sitting there. This is John Wharf. He was a Provincetown painter in the first half or first 2/3 of the 20th century. His name was Wharf, and he painted a lot of marine and seaside scenes. As you see in Provincetown, there's a Wharf's Court that's right near the Land's End Inn where we stay. We walk by this all the time. And this is my John Wharf watercolor. He was, again, particularly known for scenes of boats and marinas and things like that. But this is called Abandoned Farm. And this, again, was probably somewhere around Provincetown or Truro. And inside this area where there's cobwebs and everything, there was a mantle clock as part of this scene of just an abandoned farmhouse where people just had left it as it was for some reasons. And this is how John Wharf painted it. So, and Carl Knapp's another more abstract abstract expressionist artist in Provincetown. And I was, it's recognizable enough so I could see that there was a clock in the scene there. And of course, there's the Cahoons, which lived and worked not far from here. I'm sure all of you have been to the Cahoon Museum there. So there's Ralph and Martha that we see there. And this is one of my favorite Cahoon images. He has clocks in many of them. So you see that here's a mermaid waiting. It's called the Vigil, and with a kind of stylized, really skinny grandfather clock standing there. And there's a dog there. And the story with this is that originally that was a cat. And the people who bought the painting said, we love the painting, but we want our dog there, not a cat. So Ralph went back and did a little portrait of their poodle there instead of the cat that was there first. And the other thing that brings major connection here is that my parents in the 70s had a house in Centerville, a summer house in Centerville, and they were art collectors. And as most collectors face this, they ended up with too much stuff. So they said, hey, maybe we should become dealers, start trying to sell art. So they opened up the Daniel Frishman Gallery of Art. It was just down here on Main Street, and you'll see the building still there. But this is when it was an art gallery. My parents commissioned an artist named Marshall Joyce to paint the gallery as it was then. And there's my dad sitting there with some of the art that he loved. This is a sculpture by we live in Andover now, and Phillips Andover Academy is there, and an art professor at the school at the time was making these bronze sculptures, and my parents bought a few of them, and this one we still have on the porch at our house. So there's the building now. You may recognize it. It's just up the street there. I think it's a private home now, but it's still named Gallery Place, and it's named Gallery Place because my dad, our art gallery was there, and he also owned the cottages that were down the way that were rented out either seasonally or during the summer. So there's kind of a little bit left of his legacy of having an art gallery there not far from here. But this is one of the first images that grabbed my attention. Obviously, this is Napoleon. There's a very important French clock behind there that's got what's called the gridiron pendulum that regulates for temperature. As we see, it's about 13 minutes past 4 a.m. The candle is burning down. He's getting ready to review his troops. He's been up all night. He was working on the Napoleonic Code. And the odd thing about this is that this was commissioned by a Scottish nobleman, because the Scots still, not all of them were that happy about being part of England, and a lot of them were actually supporters of Bonaparte. So this painting was commissioned by a Scots nobleman, and it hung in a Scotch castle manor for many years. It's now at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I wrote a series of 36 articles in my collector magazine about these kinds of paintings. And part one was about this painting, where I talked about the artist, the subject, and the clock that we see in the painting. And I have reprints of those articles here all the way up through the whole series that I did. This is a Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, as you probably recognize. And I did a symposium there in 2017. That's what those two posters also refer to, because the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, I ran their symposia for several years in different cities. And this one, because it was already a passion of mine, was on this subject of horology and art. And this is yet another example, as we see the two over there, of early paintings that have clocks or watches in them. So I kind of broke these up into periods of time too, that cover various eras when of artworks that I found things in. So as you see, this is again an early painting with a very early style Augsburg or Nuremberg clock. The clocks were really first made in northern Italy and southern Germany. And this is an example that looked kind of like little buildings almost that had clockwork in them. So some of the artworks, are religious in content, as you would expect from back then. And this was an exhibit that I co-curated at the beginning of the year that was at Gordon College, a Christian school up in the North Shore. And it really reflected Gordon College's sort of years-long honors program of what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem. So they were comparing Christian thought to classical Roman and Greek thought and how those meshed and correlated. So we kind of switched this over to Greenwich, which is the mean, the Greenwich Mean Time, that's where the prime meridian is, where, the clocks had to be most accurate to determine longitude and things like that. So we kind of played off that theme, and I'll talk about this painting a little bit more in a minute. So there's me and my co-curator, who is a professor at Gordon College. So we put this nice exhibit together. As you see, we had a lot of artworks in here and a lot of examples of antique clocks were in there, including the movement of a tower clock from Newburyport from the 1700s that we were able to show, as well as kind of a maker space where we people could go in and see what's going on inside clocks, how they're made, and how they work. So if we look at this, this is a Botticelli fresco that's on the wall in Italy, and in this case, Botticelli is depicting Saint Augustine, who lived in the 300s, which was about 11 centuries before clocks existed. So what Botticelli was saying, again, people could read paintings back then, even if they couldn't read words. So the Bible, they could read paintings. And this clock is in there because it indicates the time supposedly of Saint Jerome's death. And Saint Augustine is thinking about Saint Jerome in this Botticelli painting. So, even though it's historically inaccurate, it's telling a story, and it also lets clock people like me look at what the earliest clocks look like, because he wasn't painting an antique clock, he was painting a clock of Botticelli's own period. And this is a depiction of Saint Jerome himself, who lived even earlier than Saint Augustine. And again, you see the artist has planted a clock up there in the painting again, even though it was 1200 years before clocks like this existed. The Nuremberg Chronicle was one of the first printed books. It showed images and descriptions of cities all over Europe and pictures of them. So I think this was Pisa that they were showing, but each page has them, and it's a very famous book. The originals are very rare and very valuable, but if there was a clock tower in the city, they would show it. And as you see, there's the clock tower there. But every page that had an illustration of a city with a clock tower in it, had exactly the same clock tower. So, these were printing blocks, and the guys that printed these, so they had the little block that had the clock tower in it. So that's what they put in, and that's what got printed. So this probably doesn't look like the tower that was in Pisa at the time, but they represented it as that. And that was important because cities that had clocks in their towers were considered more sophisticated, more modern, more wealthy, because they could afford to have a very expensive machine sitting inside one of their civic buildings. This is even earlier. This is perhaps one of the earliest depictions of a mechanical clock. This is representing Father Time. This is on an altar in Spain. And you see he's holding, again, an all iron, sort of a birdcage style movement. But again, that's not in there because he's a clock salesman. This is in there because because clocks are metaphors or symbols of time's passage, of human mortality. The clock ticks while you're alive and it stops when you pass away. So you need to be cognizant of how you're living your life and where you're going to go when you die. So again, it's not in there by accident or because it has to do with the clock, really. It's the message, the metaphor, the symbol that it's doing. This is one of my favorites because this is King Solomon repairing the clock. So again, this is 2 millennia before clocks were invented. But as you see here, he's got the tools there. He's working on it. He's some gears are down there. And again, it's the symbolism, that everybody would have understood that the clock really symbolizes, the secular world too, and then the hereafter, and he's manipulating that. And the figures that are shown here are the people who commissioned this painting. These were miniature paintings. These were in books of hours. So this wasn't a big painting. This was a little painting. And rich people would commission books of hours that helped them pray during the day. And they would include the images of the people who had paid for it quite often within the image. This is actually, I believe, 8 timepieces that are included in this. So we see some big clocks here. We see some smaller ones. We see some sundials over here, an astrolabe here, and a monk who's contemplating everything here. This is an example of the clock that you might have seen on the table there. They had one hand back then, which was typical. Again, with probably Southern German, and this is Saint Luke in a triptych. It's three-part altar panel, and you see again there's a clock here that would have been obviously many centuries after Saint Luke was alive. So Titian, you probably know that name, is a very famous Renaissance Italian painter. Several portraits of his have little clocks in them. So this is the Duchess of Urbino. And again, people can read this painting. She's obviously rich. She's the Duchess. She took over because her husband got in trouble and was banished from the province. So she started to run the province. You can see her lands through the window. You see her kind of almost asleep little spaniel there that showed she's, is a tender person, but she's got a clock there. She's regimented, she's disciplined, she's running the place, and she's also kind of advanced and modern technologically. So she's the one running the place and has a clock there to prove that she's on top of everything. And this is an example of the clock that we saw in that picture. Again, they weren't tremendously accurate, but they were just, again, this beautiful only machine probably that was in their households. Quite expensive, but they would tick, they were alive, they would tell the time, and they were status symbols at that time for everybody who had one. In this busy scene, this is called The Knight's Dream, and a Spanish portrait. So you see he's dreaming, there's nothing subtle about this. This is clearly an angel, and she's holding a message, saying, worry about the next life. So in these kinds of vanitas paintings, you see symbols both of earthly delights and money, and then you see clear symbols of mortality and possible death by firearms, and also just about in dead center is a clock that everybody would understand was a symbol of human mortality. And there's an example. These were actually called in German like little tower clocks because they looked like big steeples that were on churches, but they were miniature, and again only maybe 12 inches tall. So the Dutch in the golden age of Dutch painting in the 1600s produced a lot of these vanitas paintings. Again, the skulls and the tipped over wine glass, the musical instrument that was a symbol of pleasure during this life. And then there's the little pocket watch. And these are great because they're really finely detailed. You can almost, see how this watch worked. And you also knew that this was a little striking clock, a little dinging clock, because the inside of the case was a bell. So this would actually, in a little small bell sound, strike the hours as well. But one thing I love about this is you can actually see the artist. He painted himself into this reflecting glass ball that was there too. So those are fun to see. And there's another example of a vanitas painting. You see the watch here, and you see once again a glass ball where the artist is sitting there and has snuck himself into the painting as well. And there's a close-up of that watch, not only with its case, the one hand, the chain, and the type of key that would be used to wind these watches every day, or sometimes twice a day. They had to be wound up. So this is Velasquez. He's showing obviously one of the most important people in Spain at the time. And as was sometimes typical, she had two watches on there. So that kind of proved that she was rich enough to have two watches. But the problem is if you have two watches, you don't know which one is right. So you need either one or three. But two was there. And sometimes even later in the 18th century, British gentlemen would have two watches, but maybe one was a fake watch. They got stolen a lot, so maybe they would hope that the pickpocket would steal the fake watch instead. But in this case, she's just showing that she was rich enough to have two watches standing there. So of course I looked hard for Rembrandt, and did eventually find this one where this woman has a watch hanging from her dress, as was typical. The women's clothing at that time didn't have pockets, and the watches were displayed on the outside as you see here. And this is another fun Rembrandt in a way. This is a grisaille, which was the original sketch. This hangs in a museum in London. And this is Christ before Pilate. So you see a very familiar theme that a lot of artists depicted of Christ here. And we see him near an arched building with a clock. and of course, again, is 2 millennia off the date because there weren't any clocks that we know of in biblical times. So anyway, but and the numbering on here is interesting. People have written articles about it because it's not traditional numbering, and they think the numbers mean something biblical. We think maybe Rembrandt had never been to the Holy Land. He didn't know what it looked like, but you see that in Venice, there's a similar looking building, and that's probably where we got the inspiration for doing that. But when he finally produced the print based on that initial drawing, the clock is gone. So probably people said, Rembrandt, they didn't have clocks back then, and it didn't make it into the final print. So at least I know of the Rembrandt that had the clock before he took it out when he produced one of his prints. Jan Steen was another of these Dutch Golden Age painters, and he, even though his customers were the staid, black clothing Dutch burghers and rich merchants in Amsterdam, they loved these scenes of kind of dissolute life of other Dutch people who weren't as pious, weren't as rich, weren't as religious, but they liked seeing that so they could kind of compare themselves to those other people. So the titles of these things are kind of dissolution and that kind of thing. So you see the whole place is in an uproar, and here a nun and a priest are trying to put some order and some sanctity into here. But up top here, it's a little stopped by this, but I will show you close up, is a monkey playing with the chains. And monkeys, and if you're reading paintings, everyone understood that monkeys were images of kind of lust and sexuality. So the fact that the monkey is up there playing with the clock weight, in this case, everybody would understand that this was really just part of that whole mayhem that was going on at that time. This is another Dutch scene. This is a matrimonial negotiation where the prospective groom is being grilled, and you see the bride is peeking through the door, seeing how everything was going, and a lovely style of Dutch clock called the stole clock was hanging there, and there's an example of these beautifully decorated wall clocks that hung there. They're nightmares to repair, as I've learned, but they're beautiful to look at. So folk art, and you saw one example from the Bath Museum, but there are other great examples. And again, you're seeing here another kid with that watch up to the ear, hearing it tick. And here's another young person with holding on to a watch on a beautiful painted floor, and all too sometimes you don't know if these are boys or girls. Sometimes if their hair's parted in the middle, it's a girl, because boys and girls wore dresses until they were 5, 6, 7 years old. So you couldn't necessarily know which gender it was. This is one of my favorites. This is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where the artists clearly had a problem with perspective and size of things. Either the kids were huge back then, or they just were emphasizing this, and you see even the strawberries are big, and then the tiny little steeple clock out back there, and the tiny little cat there too. So this is a good thing. They think possibly the artist had a photograph of the kid's face, and then did that quite deliberately and carefully, and then built all this around it, but still maybe had a problem with scale of what these things should look like. This is a lovely early American folk art painting that I own. It's a mother and child, obviously, and you see the mother is carefully holding the watch, even though the child is holding on to the ribbon there too. They didn't want to drop it, but quite possibly this is a posthumous painting, because that was quite often done where there's a good chance that that child had passed away. And they're showing, that the memory of the child is still there, the spirit is still there, and they're doing it. She's not smiling, the kid looks a little ethereal, but there are many examples of these posthumous paintings from that period where a member of the family, a father, a mother, a child, was included even though they had passed away. So in this case, this again might be one of those because of the black dress and because of the watch, because it's like, the watch is a metaphor, a symbol for human mortality. So the fact that the watch is there is a pretty good indicator, again, that child had left this world, but was still remembered by the mother. And as we know, half the kids at that time died before the age of 5. So losing your children was not an unusual thing. But a lot of these too are just lovely portraits of women with fantastic hairstyles. And in this case, they didn't necessarily have pockets, but maybe a belt kind of arrangement on their dress, and they could tuck the watch in there. And but they wanted you to know that they had a watch and a valuable one, so they would leave enough of it peeking out so you could tell that there was a watch there. This is a miniature portrait. Again, you can see this is a woman in Lowell, Massachusetts. And you see this long chain, as they often had, slide chains, and you see the watch peeking out here too. And as you also notice, anatomically, women had no shoulders back then. So I don't know, why they later grew shoulders. You can see that this woman has shoulders, and is very proud of her big gold watch that's there, as well as of her elaborate headpiece that we're seeing there as well. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we actually see the tradesmen, the craftsmen who do this trade. So this is a portrait of a watchmaker. It was identified as a watchmaker in Vermont, but I don't think there's an ocean in Vermont. So possibly was misidentified. Of maybe he was from Vermont, but was working closer to where there was water. But this is good because we can see watchmaking tools here, where people like me can identify those tools. And then there were itinerant painters going house to house, town to town, who would stop and do these little watercolor portraits of families. And they could put a clock on the wall, whether the people actually had a clock or not. This was an expensive clock. Whether this family had a banjo clock, we're not sure of. But we can see this is 1834, and the artist, Joseph Davis is his name. He was called the left-handed painter until they figured out who he was. But you can see that the people are identified here. This is Betsy, age 40. The little kid is age 7 months. And a nice colorful floor clock. So those are lovely to see. And there's maybe 20 or 30 of these Joseph Davis itinerant painters. We see even the newspapers identified there as well. So if we change gears a little bit, this is Van Gogh. This hangs down in the Yale Art Gallery. And this is a painting around midnight in the bar in the tavern in Arles, where he would sit and drink absinthe, late into the night. And then they talk about how Van Gogh really, with his shimmering and all, sort of captured the effect of sitting there drunk while the conversations are going around, the lights are shimmering. And there's a traditional kind of French commercial clock that would have hung in an establishment like that. So Magritte, who we know of doing a lot of surrealist paintings. This is one of his famous ones. This painting is actually quite large. It's in Chicago. And it's great to see a train coming out of the fireplace. I tried to recreate this in my own house with a similar clock and all, but no train ever came out of the fireplace. So I was a little disappointed. So Matisse, this is one of his most famous paintings, a large painting. It's called the Red Studio, and of course, dead center was the tall case clock that stood in his studio. There's an image of Matisse sitting outside of his studio. Right through that door is the scene that we just saw there with his dog. Chagall had, when he grew up in Eastern Europe, in his house they had a Vienna regulator clock, like you see there, and there's a lot of Chagall paintings that have this same clock in there as he's remembering his childhood in Eastern Europe. Here's Marc Chagall painting his wife Bella. She appears in a lot of his paintings as well. And you can see in this case, he's just doing a nice portrait of his wife. So you probably know what's coming next, because this is Edvard Munch's most famous painting, but this is one that's directly relevant to me. This was painted just a year before he died, and it's a self-portrait when it's called Between the Clock and the Bed. He was trying to decide if he just finally could stop painting, take a rest. He knew he was dying, and whether he would just kind of lie down and relax for the rest of his life, or whether the clock was going to keep ticking, keep telling him you got to keep working until you're done. And there's a lot of related imagery in here. You can see there's a crucifix on the floor here. There's an open door that people would understand sort of symbolized a passage into the next world. And you also see that the clock had no hands. And that was also kind of a symbol that, time was sort of arbitrary and almost irrelevant, but the clock itself was a symbol of time's passage and human mortality. So, and you can see again, this is a large painting. There was a special exhibit of Edvard Munch, including this painting that was at the Museum of Modern Art last year where people were coming and learning about it. So Frida Kahlo, you may know that Mexican woman artist, rather eccentric, as you know, she has the unibrow here that people talk about. But she painted this just before she was getting married to Diego Rivera, the Mexican artist. Apparently the wedding was at 3 o'clock and she's doing her self-portrait with the clock approaching that because she really had mixed feelings about whether she should be marrying him or not. But they did get married and their wedding and their marriage was tumultuous, you should say. But there's Frida and Diego Rivera at that time. And Diego Rivera himself also did a painting with an alarm clock in it. So they both sort of felt the passage of time, the urgency of time, and what it was symbolizing too. This is Pablo Picasso, one of the few that have it. The title of this is Woman with a Watch. This is the second most expensive Picasso painting ever sold. I think it was in the millions. I forget the exact amount. Sold just a few years ago. I'm probably not bought by a watch collector, I'm guessing, but it's great to see it because again, most Picasso artworks are either too abstract, timepiece in them, or there's nothing in there anyway. I think I have one other example of a Picasso with, again, a woman with a wristwatch. And this is his muse, Dora Moore, at the time as he was falling in love with her after being married to a different woman. Horace Pippin, well-known African-American artist. You see, this is 1943, and he creates these interior scenes quite often of Black families, African-American families in their homes. And there's usually an alarm clock or some other kind of basic functional clock that's within the scene. Jamie Wyeth, the third in that progression of the Wyeth family of American artists. He was the youngest. He was perhaps most famous for his portrait of JFK, but he lived up on Monhegan Island for a lot of his time. And there was a kind of a wild child named Orca Bates who was, roaming the island. He had a family there, but he was pretty much on his own. And Jamie Wyeth used him as a model many times. But you see that this is called Screen Door by the Sea. So this was within its home on Monhegan Island. And we met and talked to Jamie Wyeth, and he said, yes, this clock is still in his family. So it was good to know that it was a real clock and it was there at the time. There's Jamie Wyeth, a picture of him with his dog. And this is Jamie Wyeth's studio. So if any of you are artists and think maybe you need to clean up your studio, obviously he was able to work in a studio that looked like this. So I guess nothing really, I'm not sure. I see a clock anyway. He probably didn't care at all what time it was. But it's a great image of the scene that he would work in. But this is obviously much more organized and interesting. So if we flip back to Edward Hopper for a minute, look at again, one of his most famous artworks called Nighthawks. So there's no clock in this one, but it inspired a New Yorker cover that was done for their New Year's issue. So you see, it's the same kind of scene, but the New Yorker artist not only has given them party hats for New Year's Eve, but he has put a clock on the wall of the diner showing that it's just about midnight too. So I have a pretty good collection of New Yorker covers that have imagery in it. You'll see a couple of more. This is another one that's kind of seasonally related, where Santa's getting kind of worried that it's almost midnight and his reindeer is still playing cards. So he's trying to get that on board. And this is an artist in '61 named Kowarski. He was quite a prolific New Yorker cover artist. We've been to an exhibit, sort of a retrospective of all the covers he did, but obviously this is a clockmaker, a watchmaker shop. He's there sitting and working on this. And I'm fortunate enough to own the original artwork of this. I have the watercolor of this that I was able to get at auction. So I really feel like I'm communing with Kowarski because I have his original work. And here's another great one too of a watchmaker, again by in '44. Again, another artist, New Yorker cover artist that did more than 200 200 covers for the New Yorker and thousands of those little spots, the little tiny drawings that are inside the New Yorker. So he was a very prolific New Yorker artist, but of course this one got my attention most dramatically for that. And this maybe is one of my favorites too. If many of us have dogs or have had dogs, you can understand that it's getting close to when the owner's gonna come walking through that door. And this is again Booth, who we probably all recognize as again a very prolific, well-known New Yorker artist as well. And you know, again, illustration, as we talked about before, that's certainly part of art. We shouldn't disparage it. Not everybody thinks it's fine art, but certainly the argument I think is over about Norman Rockwell, you know, not being an artist, just an illustrator. We know that he was an important and very high level American artist. So this, of course, is one of my favorites. This is in Chicago. He's using his pocket watch to set the time. And this is another great Norman Rockwell painting where the couple has been just enjoying their evening together, and he suddenly realizes when the cuckoo's popping out that it's midnight and maybe they've overstayed their welcome. This painting, unfortunately, it went a little bit higher than I could afford. The auction estimate just recently sold. The estimate was 800,000, actually sold for $900,000. So I don't own this, even though I would have loved to, and I don't know who owns it. But it was interesting that Rockwell paintings still come up for sale, including one that, of course, I would have loved to have if I could have. And of course, Gary Larson, we all loved his. We all loved his cartoons, and several of them have clocks on the wall just because they have clocks on the wall. But this is a great one too, where something dramatic is about to happen probably in this cartoon. So there's a whole segment to a photography, and not every photograph is fine art, but a lot of them are, and a lot of photographers are acknowledged as fine artists. So this is a Newton, Massachusetts railroad station, and you see one of these two-sided clocks in a photograph of that scene. This is a daguerreotype. We don't know why this young man decided to bring his big clock to the studio and put it on his lap. You know, usually people had their kid or their wife or something, but this guy, I guess he loved his clock and he wanted a picture of it there. So that was a fun daguerreotype to see. That's the type of clock he's holding. These were sometimes called slave front clocks. They were Philadelphia, they were Connecticut clocks from the first half of the 19th century with their reverse painted glasses, and also that's what he was holding and obviously wanted there for posterity. This is a daguerreotype I recently was able to buy, and this clock is quite unusual because of that slot in the dial that was an invention, and only rare examples exist of a Connecticut clockmaker named S.B. Terry. And there are no known pictures, images, painted portraits, photographs of S.B. Terry, except possibly this one, because we can't imagine why any other clockmaker would be sitting there with a rare S.B. Terry clock. So, I don't know how we ever prove this until we find another portrait of S.B. Terry. It looks kind of like his son that we have pictures of. But there's a good chance that it is the only known image of a quite important and well-known Connecticut clockmaker from the 19th century. And we see some of his tools there as well. So, and usually the Greenleaf sisters, the Boston Athenaeum has a lovely collection of daguerreotypes. And you see she was quite proud of the fact that she had a gold watch and it was there hanging. And a lot of these are slightly hand tinted, as you see, so we get a little rosiness effect on her cheeks there, just to enhance the image somewhat, because obviously daguerreotypes were not color photography, but many were hand colored so that they got a little bit more life to them. And often the people are not smiling. I think they thought that smiling, looked like you were kind of not serious or frivolous. But this guy, he's working on it more because he's quite proud, obviously, of the nice thick pocket watch that he also made sure was there. And some of these also have these painted backdrops where it wasn't just a curtain or a wall behind there. There'd be something decorative behind them that would enhance the picture as well. And you see, even this is kind of hand tinted also to give a little color to that daguerreotype. And here's our image again. This time it's a grown person who's got that watch ticking up in front of their ear like that. So I think anybody with a watch, if you want to go like this now, go ahead, because it must be fun to do. There's a great exhibit now at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, and it's all about scenic daguerreotypes. They're much rarer, mostly daguerreotypes are portraits, but some photographers at that time went outside, took pictures of buildings, took pictures of landscapes, and most of the 84 daguerreotypes, 82 of them belong to a good friend of mine. He's collected these for decades. And now there's a beautiful exhibit there at the Wadsworth, which is a great museum anyway in Hartford, so it's not too far for anybody to travel to. So one of the ones that I looked at somewhat closely, I said, well, this is a great exterior scene. So this again is showing these outdoor scenes that were not captured very often. But when I looked closer, I always look in these scenes for watchmaker signs. So these were double-sided. They hung outside of a watchmaker or clockmaker shop because the places didn't have addresses a lot. And if they had a trade sign out front, you knew that you were finding the store that you wanted to. But there's a close-up of that daguerreotype, and lo and behold, there is a watchmaker's trade sign hanging outside of this building. And because I was able to enlarge this, daguerreotypes are pretty sharp usually. I was also able to see a clock dial in the window there. So I was even more assured that this was a clock and watch guy's shop that had been captured in this daguerreotype probably from the 1850s. So Matthew Brady, one of the most famous Civil War era American photographers, took a lot of pictures of the Civil War that he was most famous for, but he also had a portrait gallery where he took pictures mostly of famous Americans. And if you wanted to, you could be pictured with this clock, because he had that in his studio. I looked at 7,000 Matthew Brady portraits, and I found 1% that people decided to sit there with this clock. It's called the Reaper model. And as everybody would understand again too, that was a metaphor for the Civil War, because soldiers on both sides were just mown down, by modern weaponry. And this is a Reaper who has a scythe who's just chopping the wheat away the same way that tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides of the Civil War were mown down in the same way. And that's kind of relevant because this is Clara Barton. She was the famous nurse during the Civil War, who then went on to found the American Red Cross. So when she visited Brady's studio, she decided she wanted to be pictured with that clock. And there's even a more famous person who wanted to be with that clock. You probably can guess that that's George Custer. He showed up several times at Brady's studio to have his picture taken. Apparently, he had a really large, great opinion of himself and wanted to be pictured as often as he could be. He's also got the Lincoln Bible in there too. Many more people had their pictures taken with their hand on the Lincoln Bible, because Lincoln too was photographed by Brady and had his hand on that Bible. But this is an even clearer view of the Reaper clock that was there in Matthew Brady's studio. Bernice Abbott, an early 20th century photographer, took a lot of pictures in New York. This one is a great picture on Christopher Street on the lower end of Manhattan. You can actually see watchmaker tools in the windows, as well as this nice clock dial. This is perhaps one of her most iconic photographs. It's within her Tempo of the City series. She was a WPA supported artist. The government was giving money to artists during the Depression to help them get by and also to promote American artists. So this is a clock that stands on Fifth Avenue and it's still there. So I walk by it quite often when we're in there. We can see when I took this picture, which a couple of years ago, that isn't there anymore, but the clock still stands there, still tells the right time, and that's the clock that Bernice Abbott took a picture of all those years ago. She also visited and took a picture of a photographer named Louis Hine, who became very famous in the early 1900s of taking pictures of child labor. And he was part of the Child Labor Committee, and his pictures and the accompanying text helped with the passage of child labor laws that changed the way that kids could just be exploited, and as soon as they could walk, almost be employed in factories. So he was important for that. But then he went on to do other types of photography. I did a article about his his pictures that he took at the Hamilton Watch Factory. But he also took many pictures at Ellis Island. He went out there and asked the people flooding in, can you wait a minute while I take your picture? And then he flashed his magnesium flash, blinding everybody. But he took some interesting and important pictures of people arriving, and then he would visit them in the tenement houses too. So this is a Louis Hine picture when he went into one of these overcrowded New York City tenements. But you see, they could afford one of these inexpensive Connecticut clocks. So you see it there on the mantle. Perhaps was the most valuable and valued thing that this family had while they were living there. But there's the Hamilton Watch Factory, because Louis Hine was also hired by the WPA, the National Research Project, to visit factories that were innovative, because they were still trying to get out of the Depression. Let's find these businesses that aren't the old ones grinding out, whatever they were doing. These are ones that are doing innovative, new products and with new skills. And he was for about 7 months, he was hired to document those. And one that he visited and took a lot of fascinating pictures of was the Hamilton Watch Factory in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he had to write captions that indicated the level of skill that was required to do each of these jobs. So some were fairly low skill, but some were much higher skill. And that was used by the federal government to see if they could promote more of those kinds of industries that use skilled people. And everyone was worried that, automation is going to make people lose their jobs, sort of like we're worried now with AI. But in fact, the opposite happened, because these businesses became much more productive and efficient, and they could grow and hire even more people to do these skilled jobs. So they didn't really eliminate jobs, they created jobs, and better jobs, as it turns out, than just assembly line people like we're at Henry Ford's Model T factory. So this is one of my favorites too, William Wegman, a photographer who always takes pictures of his Weimaraner dogs. So we see what time it is when this dog is typing away. So as we end up here, I just have a few posters, because they were beautiful, done by well-known artists. They're signed, and we know that these were important artists. This is from the 1920s. Poster collectors, look for these kind of things. Omega watches, you probably all heard of. And this was a Italian clockmaking company and dealer that sold some German clocks too. So I've given you, I hope, a nice presentation of horology and art, a nice train load here. And I see that it's time for me to wrap up. This is a poster from a jewelry store in Zurich, Switzerland, that's still there, that's still kind of like Tiffany's, sells very high-end jewelry and watches and all to Swiss and international customers. This is a poster from the 1950s from that store, where he's examining his watch, and I'm examining mine and saying I should wrap up at this point. I'm happy to talk to you more about this as we wrap up here. Thanks.